Firstly, thank you very much for inviting me. I feel quite privileged to do this, to give this talk. I feel a bit nervous because actually I'm kind of aware that most of you know a hell of a lot more about running a library than I do. I've been an English and media teacher for the last 23 years in various state schools in London, around the country. Obviously I've worked with librarians and I teach in the library a lot, but I am quite aware of there's lots of things I don't really know about, so maybe as I go along you can help me out. Right, well, that wasn't very good, was it? Okay, so I've been given a quite specific outline as to what to look at, and I'm going to be looking at what education is for, a kind of very big question, exploring the ideals of eudaimonia, something that Aristotle arrived at, the Greek philosopher, the belief that life should be a kind of flourishing, a continual flourishing, and that's not only for children but for adults as well, a continual process of learning, and exploring about what makes independent learners, creators, people motivated, happy, imaginative and moral. And specifically my brief was, we would like you to base your talk on how school libraries and librarians can contribute to these ideals. I will give some of my thoughts. I hope they come some way to sort of suggesting some thoughts I have on this, but it is a very ambitious task in a way for me. I feel quite daunted by it, so please don't criticize me too much if I haven't quite covered everything there. What I'm going to do specifically in relation to this, I'm going to explore the different models for education, two sort of philosophical models, and I'm going to look at a thinker, Paulo Freire. Does anyone, put your hands up, anyone aware of this thinker, Brazilian thinker? 1, 2, 3, 4, a few people, so you can help me out along the way if you want to. And I'm going to also look at post-modernism, which I think possibly is relevant here, but I might annoy quite a few people by some things I say, so hopefully that will be generate something of a debate. So I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes, 30 minutes, and then we'll have hopefully some questions. Okay, I think the first thing to look at is the idea of education as social control. Brian Simon wrote the definitive history of education in England, a number of volumes, and he shows, I think, really clearly with lots of evidence that the Victorians set up the current education system, which actually, if you look at it in the 1870s, hasn't changed a huge amount from what we've got at the moment. Obviously, there's lots of sort of details that are different. And his contention is that the school system was set up explicitly to preserve the Victorian class system. And so he goes through the different stages of it, but in very brief summary, you have schools have different names, but are very similar to what we might call secondary moderns. And these schools are really holding pens for children. Their primary purpose is not really to educate, and the people in power are not that interested in education happening in these places in the same way. These are places where children learn to be obedient citizens as opposed to being purposeful, kind of imaginative workers. The grammar schools were there to educate the kind of middle tier, the emerging sort of middle class of Victorian England, and that was developed in the 1944 Act, which established a very clear distinction between secondary moderns and grammar schools. And then you had the private schools for the wealthier people, and then you had the elite public schools educating the elite, like Eton and Wellington and places, and they were there to educate the politicians and barristers. And I guess if you look at the state of affairs in England today, you can say that, you know, still these public schools are producing, by and large, the people who rule us. You only have to look at our cabinet to see that. Okay, so let's not be too critical of the idea, though, of schools being there for social control. That is actually a pretty good purpose, isn't it, in some sorts of ways? Yeah, so there are some real benefits, and I think, you know, a lot of kind of socialist thinkers have seen school as having a very important purpose, to have school as a place of a mutual coming together of the next generation. It's there for social cohesion. That's certainly something a local schools network, I think all of us believe in, that, you know, you need to have schools there, and one of their purposes is to bring communities together. But of course, you have the opposite side there, the idea that school is essentially a kind of prison, a holding pen for children. And I think if you look at the history, there has been a very explicit social project by the governor, the people running the country, for that to be the case. And then, you know, it's there for social cohesion, but the opposite to that is it can be there to enforce existing social segregation, ethnic, gender segregation, a definitive agenda in certain communities and certain people in power for separating children off from one another in local communities. So, you know, you could say that there's an important agenda, possibly in education, to mingle people of different social, ethnic classes. And then, you know, at the heart of this is the whole idea of assessment. You know, the person perhaps who's seeing school as a kind of important positive force for social control would attempt to match talents of children with their roles and their identities, so that people feel kind of validated by the society they're living in. And the assessment, the exam system, or, you know, students being assessed by teachers, or the people in schools, they will be there to match children with the relevant role. But of course, then you have the opposite side of that assessment, the kind of idea of built-in failure, you know, and that's clearly what we have at the moment in many Western countries, that, you know, we know a definitive amount. At the moment, it's 40% of children will fail their English GCSE, which seems to have become a benchmark for, you know, whether someone is achieving in education. Well, you could have an argument, you know, you have a social control library, and the social control library, which is kind of the idea of school as a prison, a holding pen for children. There'll be a clear hierarchy of books that mirrors the social class system. Simple text for the less able, for the poor, socially deprived, a policy of exclusion. You're not welcome here if you're stupid, so-called stupid. And more advanced text for the elite, the rich, the advantaged, the middle classes. A strong emphasis on social controls, silence, the librarian as custodian of the social and literary hierarchy. There are some really noted thinkers that have argued this, and I think something I've looked at in my own research is Leavis's role. I don't know if you're aware of him as a literary critic, but he wrote a book called A Great Tradition, and he argues very, very eloquently and very persuasively that we can have certain people like him who can make aesthetic judgments about what is suitable reading for our children, and that because he is endowed with this superior intelligence, he can then enforce this throughout the country, and this is going to be an important form of education as he sees it. The opposite side to seeing education as social control is education as emancipation. And this is seeing education as a utopian project that is going to change society for the better, to enrich everyone's lives, both materially, creatively, epistemologically. That's the idea of, that it's about generating new forms of knowledge. Epistemology is a study of knowledge. And I have to say, it's really interesting, but I think there is a political agenda in our society, whatever both the Tories and the Labour government have had this at the back of their mind recently. I think things have changed. I really think that for all my criticisms of Michael Gove, I certainly think that he, in his mind, believes that his reforms will emancipate the vast majority of children to be creative and productive thinkers. I think that if you look at what he says, that's certainly what he believes. I don't feel his reforms will do that, and maybe some people do. And Blair certainly set this agenda, didn't he? Education, education, education. You have organisations like the Educational Endowment Fund who have an explicit emancipatory agenda to close the gap so that children from poorer backgrounds can achieve just as well as people children coming from more advantaged backgrounds. I think you see this most clearly in places, the Academies and Free Schools programme, which I have problems with. It's interesting, though, to note that Gove didn't really allow these schools to select in terms of ability. He hasn't brought back the grammar school system. They select in other ways, which I think is quite problematic, but he hasn't. And there's this idea that these schools will replace the grammar schools as elite schools in the eyes of the Conservative government. There is a focus on both sides on children on free school meals. So, and that's a very clear, specific agenda with things like the pupil premium coming from the Liberal Democrats, but backed up by the Tories, and the Labour Party have a slightly different kind of way of doing this, but they certainly support the idea. Universities are changing their entrance requirements so that they can try and get children from poorer backgrounds and more diverse backgrounds into them. So there is the beginnings, I think, of an emancipatory agenda in all sides. But I suppose we have to sort of say, what is emancipation? What is setting children free from their sort of the limits of their social background, their social background? I suppose the Govian agenda, as he feels quite specifically, that the traditional approach to education will do this. Teacher-centred, authoritarian, rote learning, drilling for exams, higher attainment in the more academic subjects. We've got this idea, I don't know if you've come across it, Progress 8 is going to be a massive issue in schools in the next few years, but schools are only just waking up to this. But the government are going to start measuring how much value is added in very specific subjects such as English, Maths, Science, MFL, Humanities. And this is coming from Gove, but actually behind it all is a thinker called E.D. Hirsch, an American academic who really feels that children, to be liberated in their minds, have to learn a set body of facts that is being chosen by sort of specific authorities, informed authorities. We're back to the kind of Leavisite idea of the kind of great tradition of knowledge. And I think that Leavis really is a ghost that haunts a lot of what Michael Gove does. I suppose then there's the opposite approach. There's the creative approach, that somehow we can emancipate people through creativity. And this is a holistic approach where learning is child-centred as opposed to teacher-centred. It's about problem solving. It's about creating art, drama, poetry. And there's a long line of distinguished kind of philosophical thought here, and I suppose the most noted are people like Maria Montessori, Rudolf Steiner, Dewey, and then recently Ken Robinson have all argued really passionately that this is actually the way we are going to make our children sort of emancipate them from their whatever difficult positions they are in. And I suppose, to be honest, as a teacher, I think there's a middle ground, which most teachers possibly are situated in, if they thought about it, in which teaches the traditional subjects perhaps in creative ways, mediating between a traditional and more child-centred ways of teaching. And I think a lot of state school teachers I come across are constantly sort of juggling with the two sort of techniques of approaches. Following on from that, I want to talk about Paulo Freire, because I think that he, for me, is the most important thinker about emancipatory education. He's a Brazilian educator who did much of his work in the 1950s, 60s and 70s in Brazil, and he worked with some very poor people living in rural communities in Brazil, and he started with these people's lives. Most of them could not read or write at all. They were adults, and he started these little micro schools where his teachers would be trained to listen to whoever wanted to learn how to read and write, and would tell them, spell out the words that they needed to know in their own life. So everything was rooted in what they needed to know, and that was the starting point of the education. It was tremendously successful, and people learnt to read and write very quickly because everything was relevant to their own life. And so this was emancipatory because they could then start to write and reflect about what was going on in their own lives. They were able to write letters and notes. They were able to protest, and this was a big thing that Freire had, was that, you know, the education enabled them to protest against the social conditions they were suffering in. And he had these strictures, you know, that are the base of, for him, emancipatory education, that the starting point is people's lives. It is your own life, your students' lives. Education has to be relevant to its context, so you have to start with the context, whoever you're working with, and listen and develop a dialogue with that person as to what is going on in their life. And then you can then go forward and think about the sorts of texts they need to benefit from reading. And he writes, he was very critical of what he calls the banking concept of education. He said, and this is the idea, I suppose the simplest idea is just the idea that students are like milk bottles that need to be filled up with knowledge. And I have to say, I know that I'm saying that very simply, but actually I've taught for 20 years and I've gone through this, and I often think this, I still think this, oh God, these students just need to be filled up with all this knowledge and everything will be fine. But of course, it doesn't work like that, even though you think it does, and even though, you know, you've been trained to realize that it doesn't. And he writes, I think it's an important quote, the banking concept, with its tendency to dichotomize everything, to tendency to divide everything up into specific little blobs of information, distinguishes two stages in the action of the educator. During the first, he cognizes a cognizable object while he prepares his lessons in his study or laboratory. So what happens is that learning is abstracted from the student's life. The teacher goes away to a place and they think, oh, right, they need to know this. But they haven't considered the context of the student's life at all. And this happens a lot in centralized kind of education systems where, you know, you're just told, right, you've got to teach this, okay? and you're given the cognizable object, you're given the blob of information that you have to then impart to the student. And he says this is highly problematic. In fact, he calls it oppressive, because the moment you are doing this, you are actually subjugating, you are turning education into a form of social control. You're saying to a passive person, you have to learn this, that is, you're here, you know, basically you're in a form of prison, intellectual prison, and you have to learn this. And he says every prescription represents the imposition of an individual's choice upon another, transforming the consciousness of the person prescribed into one that conforms with the prescriber's consciousness. So again, we're back to the idea of education as social control, that you prescribe what they have to teach, and that is what happens. I thought I'd have a little break for a minute or two, because maybe we just I'm doing a kind of slightly oppressive thing in a way, just giving you a lecture like this. Spend a minute or two and you can think to yourself, I think it's important that Freire doesn't actually force you to do anything you don't want to do. So if you don't want to talk to someone sitting next to you, I'm suggesting you could. You don't have to. You can just think some thoughts. And I'd like to think about, you know, pick one of these questions you like most. What do you like or dislike most about your job? How did you learn to read? What was your attitude towards libraries when you were a child? How did you feel when you were a child about books? And I've put those questions up there as a choice because I think that's quite an interesting starting point for me, talking and starting to enter a dialogue with you about, you know, how you're feeling about what you need to know. Okay, can I spend just a couple of minutes discussing in pairs that? And if you want to think it for yourself, you can. Okay, off you go. One thing I'd just like to point out about the exercise, which is something that, you know, I think I forget to do as a teacher, is to start to enter dialogues with children about, you know, what they like and dislike, and just listen to them. And I think that going back to Freire helps me do that. And it was really interesting. Went over to the far reaches over there. I can't see you. And just had a kind of one-to-one dialogue with two people, and it was really a fruitful thing, and actually often can be a bit more reliable than just if I say hands up, because I'm not going to do that right now because I need to move on. Yeah, it's just a kind of those sorts of Freirean questions possibly can inform your practice as librarians, you know, starting with the children's lives and seeing, you know, what they like, dislike. And I'm sure you actually do it anyway, but I'm just trying to sort of situate it in more of a kind of theoretical context and make you realise, you know, what you're doing right. Yeah, the Freirean librarian, I suppose the emphasis is going to be on dialogue and listening. The librarian who listens to students' interests, draws out from them what they like and dislikes, and enters a dialogue with them about the text they want to see in the library. This is an ongoing dialectical process, and in fact is incredibly sophisticated. The most sophisticated kind of intellectual thing we do is have dialogue with each other, listen to each other, and build on what someone else has said, and we then create our own reality from it. And I think so much of what you learn in schools kind of says, oh, conversation is important, we've got to be silent, we've got to be scribbling on a piece of paper, but actually intellectually and neurologically we know that actually the most sophisticated thing is actually having conversations with each other, and actually neurologically speaking, writing something on a piece of paper isn't as sophisticated a process. It's a learned process, but it's not something that takes in so many different kind of eventualities, and we forget that. We forget that as we go through the education system. So the librarian leads students to other texts, enabling an opening out of thought. You know, so this isn't. I'm not saying dumb everything down and just be at the student's level. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying start with the student and start with where they're at, and then it's educare, isn't it? It's a leading forth, it's a leading out, but you need to listen, and you need to trust your own instincts as to what is appropriate at that particular time, and trust your intuition. Freirean libraries built around this idea of Praxis. The librarian takes necessary social actions to change oppressive conditions, possibly rearranging furniture, thinking about displays, considering oppressive students and teachers within the library context, and opening a dialogue about that, possibly with yourself, writing a diary about it. If you can't talk to anyone, write a diary about it and start to have a dialogue about what is actually going on, what is oppressive, what is not right, and trust your intuitions with this. Ownership. Library, this is an interesting one. The library is a shared communal space, and I'm sure you've had loads of training on this, but you know, it's not my library, and I have come across librarians who, in my career, not where I'm teaching at the moment, who have said this, and this ownership thing, I think the use of pronouns is important. Otherwise, there is a very kind of them and us attitude. The library is a venue for social justice in the kind of Freirean sense. Talks, council meetings, group works, encouraged there, possibly. The Freirean librarian is interested in this something, I can barely say it, conscientization, sorry, which is the idea of where consciousness is both collective and individual is developed. So it's a constantly evolving place where people in a community are starting to build a culture and talk about important things in their communities, talk about things that are happening outside the school. You know, if there's a traffic problem, bring it into library in a certain sense, you know, have books related to it, or pin up newspaper articles related to it, you know, start to develop a kind of shared talk about things. A CPD shelf for teachers, get them in the library, you know, somehow, because actually in many schools I've been in, a lot of teachers never go there, which kind of surprises me, but in a way they're frightened too. New ideas in the library are promoted there. New texts are highlighted, interrogated, celebrated. New technology is showcased and questioned and celebrated. I'll talk a bit more about technology a bit later on, because I do think it's important to question some of what's happening with technology in the library. The Freirean library is a lived experience. The lived experience of members of the library are celebrated and showcased. Work is displayed from students. Books are published. I mean, it's so exciting at the moment. You know, you could set up your own self-publishing company. I'm not saying you have to, but that's just something I'm experimenting with myself, being self-publishing, and we've now set up in my school a school publishing press, and we're going to be, the year 9s have written Christmas stories. We've got a real problem with year 9s not actually reading anything. I'm sure that'd be familiar to anyone who's in the secondary sector. Reading kind of, so we've got them writing stories, and we're going to publish them as a book and give them to the new year group. Students and teachers are celebrated. The links between lived experience and text, cartoon bubbles for students talking about the books they like. Again, I'm sure this is loads of stuff that happens already, but it's Freirean actually in kind of ideas. This is a kind of Freirean concept. Cards where student teachers write about favourite books. I mean, I think that's a really good, very Freirean idea, isn't it? Where you've just got kind of, they have them in some bookshops and libraries, don't they? Where I love this book, you know, and it's about people's own lives, their own contexts within the school. And I suppose the emancipatory library, every librarian is asking continually, what is this library for? You know, what are its aims and purposes? What am I trying to achieve? And who is it for? And what I would like to a couple of minutes, I know I have to move on, but I think this is a really important thing. If you could just have is this something you've already discussed in groups already? But could you just spend a couple of minutes discussing what you think the library is for and its aims and purposes, and then we'll move on quickly. Okay, off you go. I'm going to move on because I've got a few more things I want to say. And I want to move on to a slightly different kind of topic, almost kind of veering sideways, and look at the idea of the postmodern library. This interests me. I mean, this is slightly different. Freire, of course, was a Marxist Brazilian educator, and many of his ideas are rooted in sort of Marxist theory. So. And I think the postmodernist in many ways is the opposite of Freire, and there's tensions here, which I'm interested in. And I'll just talk to you. I think that we need to think about, I think the libraries are in a very kind of postmodern position at the moment, in the sense that there's a very uneasy position for the book in society generally. Hard copy books, being turned into e-books. What is actually a book, anymore? And what is actually a library? And that is a very kind of postmodern concept and idea, isn't it, that we're shifting into a world where all of these sort of boundaries are being blurred constantly. What's a text? And I suppose postmodernist thought, some of the thinkers try to embrace some of the multiplicity of texts, the polyphony of voices. A thinker called Bakhtin looks and celebrates kind of the many diversity of lots of different voices in society and in texts. The crossover of styles, genres, classifications constantly being blurred. And I suppose the postmodernist librarian is a questioning librarian. We're developing the kind of idea and is looking quite closely at what actually is going on in society. Foucault looked at discourses of power, a French kind of post-structuralist thinker, we could call him, but and he's exploring. I'm really interested about why libraries are being renamed learning zones and LRCs, and because I think that is the kind of hierarchy of power within schools trying to claim the library for their own, and often colonizing the library, and that often means stripping out all the books and putting a load of computers in. And actually, you know what? It doesn't make sense, because isn't the whole of the school supposed to be a learning zone? And isn't that, and learning zone has connotations with it, which I find very troubling. It's science fiction-like kind of, you will learn here, and I am troubled by it. So, and my supervisor at Goldsmiths, because I'm doing a PhD there, Rosalind George, she uses the phrase, the colonization of the mind that goes on in school, that you start buying into these discourses of power, you start spouting them yourself, and I know that myself, you start saying the learning zone, and then the place becomes a completely different place, doesn't it? And how did this happen, and how did we allow it to happen? And I think the postmodernist starts to question some of these things and say, hang on a minute, is this actually the right thing to be calling the library? And what's this then leading on to? Where's this all going? Because I think that, it's often going to a place where the library becomes colonized by institutions like Ofsted, by the exam system. It becomes a place where it's full of exam texts, full of it's graded in an Ofsted-like way. And actually, maybe if we still called it a library, maybe it would be slightly outside those things that actually could possibly are quite destructive. So the library, by being called a library, is outside these what I would call hegemonic discourses, these discourses of power. And so I would like to reclaim the word library. I think that everyone should try and do this possibly, and we can have a discussion if you think. The word library has, for me, the smell of otherworldliness. It has a smell of, I don't know, I watched a Doctor Who episode where, there was a library and it was an important library. And I think that, for me, library is an important word, coming from the word liber, of course, book. And, of course, the word book and the concept of book is changing, but I don't think it's an invalid concept. I think the concept of book is a very interesting one, a place where people can bring their thoughts together and can be collected together. Not this amorphous, almost using Govian sort of metaphor, amorphous blobby mass that could be the learning zone, where it just feels to me not quite right. But Postmodernism, I think, comes into a lot of tension with some of the thinking that goes on in schools. So the Enlightenment sort of model for thinking is that there's a fixed body of knowledge, a definitive canon, usually decided by male white voices, whereas the postmodernist is constantly questioning patriarchal, kind of male-dominated discourses, saying there's no sort of eternal truths, looking at knowledge as a kind of cultural construction. The Enlightenment idea is a Newtonian universe of rules and regulations and things working and making sense. And I think the reality is we live in Einstein's universe, the universe of relativity, of quantum mechanics, where things are not quite what they seem to be at all. So what does a postmodern library look like? Well, I was thinking about this, and again, this is probably stuff that you may do or you totally reject, so I'm going to throw it out there. I think that the postmodern library plays fast and loose with traditional library classifications. They're there, and I really passionately believe they should be taught, but it's only one method of classification. There's a radical contextualization of text. I think that's a constant theme in postmodern thought, that one needs to sort of contextualize things very, very clearly. So, for example, and again, I'm sure this is stuff that's going on, and I'm just a school teacher. I've just seen my limited school. So if you're doing stuff like this, I'd be really interested to talk to you. Football, so for example, if you've listened to a lot of people, and it seems to be a theme, I was listening in a previous talk, football and fighting seems to be a dominant theme of interest to many children. You know, you could have a little learning bower, or whatever you might want to call it, of football novels, easy reads, I don't know, even TV screens, a history of football, games in a kind of, in a place that's going to sort of draw people in, lead people in to kind of further thought and investigation and dialogue about the issue. You might have a place where gender is deconstructed. I mean, I'm troubled by the kind of constant sort of pink girly books that seem to reinforce very sort of challenging gender stereotypes. And they could be juxtaposed next to feminist texts. Spare Rib could be next to Grazia, you know. It's just kind of trying to rethink things in that way. The postmodern state of mind, I suppose it's a librarian as a listener, is open-minded about literary, social, psychological, professional hierarchies, someone who is a bit of an outsider, who is looking and observing what's going on. Reading, writing programs that start where the child is at. And perhaps the librarian is a place of what Foucault calls resistance, you know, a place where things are done slightly differently. He doesn't mean it a kind of active sort of political manning of the barricades in the way that Freirean might do, but just you're doing something slightly different. So I'm going to sum up. I think that some of the major points I've covered are looking at education as a sort of social control and the problems with seeing children as passive learners, obedient, compliant, and ultimately needing to be brainwashed. And then arguing the case that education does have to have an emancipatory purpose. You know, creativity, problem-solving, initiative, and confidence are primary purposes to education, and that these two approaches, the Freirean and the postmodern approach, possibly can encourage this. And I had, because I'm such a teacher, I always cover questions. I've got a couple of questions to ask, but if you want to spend a minute discussing in groups, you know, either these questions or anything else you want to ask, and then I'll take a few questions for the last few minutes of the show. But that's it from my talk. Thank you.